Hi everybody, thank you for joining us this afternoon and welcome to this Chem Showcase webinar. It's titled Power Up Your School Performance. My name is Gemma Valpy, I'm the Head of Business Development for Chem in the UK, and I'm joined by John Bunyan, our Business Development Manager. John has worked in education since 2010, and prior to Chem, John has held senior positions in assessment, education, training, technology and consulting sectors. With a passion for learning, John gained his MBA from Durham University in 2007, and he champions the effective use of data insight in informing decision making in schools. So I'm going to hand over to John shortly to cover today's agenda, which is the introduction to baseline assessments, the benefit of adaptive tests, and what you as teachers can do with the data that you get from the assessments. First of all, we've got a couple of housekeeping points. So we have you all in listen only mode today, so we can't hear any of you, but we do welcome questions. So if you want to post them into the chat section on the right hand side of your screen, and we'll make sure we answer them all at the end of the webinar. There's also going to be a couple of emails that come out to you after the webinar. So the first one will give you a certificate of attendance for today, and the second one will be a recording of the webinar as well as the slide deck that we're going to use. So John, I'm going to hand over to you, and you're going to talk through baseline assessments, adaptive tests and use of data for us.
Lovely, thanks Gemma. Good morning, good afternoon, evening, wherever you happen to be today, everyone. As Gemma said, my name is John Bunyan, Business Development Manager here at Chem. I started my career actually in media, and media, much like schools, is a real data generating machine. There's an absolute plethora of it, and actually navigating your way through it can be quite difficult at times, and just in the same way that the data literacy that you have within the school is incredibly important. So as Gemma said, today we're going to be looking at an introduction to our baseline assessments and what baseline actually means, what the difference is in particular between static and traditional tests. Both have their advantages, both have their disadvantages. Ultimately, and this is the exciting part, what you can do with the data, because otherwise what's the point in doing it in the first place, what the benefits of it, and then we'll take some questions and answers at the end. But first off, I thought I'd start with a good pie chart. Everybody loves a good pie chart, and I know it sounds really simple, but any journey's got at least 2 points in it. It's got a start, it's got an end. And we're all really familiar with where the end is, and that's, you know, the GCSEs often at the end of the rainbow, and also we're very aware of the curriculum itself that we need to follow and what we need to teach within it. And as a result, we've got a range of resources as we go along through it. But often cases, this works on the assumption that all the buckets, if you like, all the students are empty, and we just need to fill them. But as we all know, if you pardon the analogy, that not all buckets are the same. And so using the same method of pouring, if you forgive the analogy again, will likely yield pretty inconsistent results at best. So anyway, what am I talking about in terms of this context, in terms of teaching? So I thought maybe best to start with a little story, and this was the story of my training year when I trained to teach. And the school where I was at knew my background. Obviously, I was late to teaching, and so I was given, if you like, also minus a secondment over to the head of year 7, and Anne, a wonderful lady who also looked after transition, as you probably imagine. And Anne did this every year, and so she had me sat down, and we had about a dozen feeder schools, and each of the feeder schools would send us in a spreadsheet. All of these spreadsheets were in a variety of different formats and colours and fonts, and the data in it just looked like it was all over the place. And the bit that really got me was that Anne mentally applied a filter to each of these spreadsheets. She knew, oh, that school's a bit generous, that school's a bit pessimistic, they're about right. And this was all about trying to put all of the kids, before they started the school, into, I suppose, their relevant classes. For want of a better term, that's where you want to start, but also really importantly in terms of the sorts of things and interventions that she was going to have to do before they actually got there. I'm sure this is a really common, if you like, situation that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. But it was that particular story that actually that kind of got me thinking. I was thinking, this is mad, because I came from a background of using objective data to inform decision making, and here's this highly professional, obviously very qualified woman mentally applying subjective filters in her head based on what she thought and from experience came through from all of these different schools. And you know, you think, well, there must be a different way. There must be a better way of actually organising what you've got at the start of an academic year. Now, this is the interesting thing, and the little question mark that we've got here, and this is that missing piece that we might be missing, because I didn't know about Chem when I trained to teach. And it's having this objective data at the start of the year where you can actually start to hang a lot of the rest of your data on it. So it's not the be all and end all. It's not going to answer all of your problems and all of your questions. It's actually going to help you ask the right ones, and it's going to help you put all of your data into the right order, or at the very least give it context, which means you can then start to ask questions, and informed questions. So what you've got your typical assessment cycle. You've got your resources as you go through it. You've got your summatives at the end of it, but we want to know where we're starting from. And this is the interesting piece, because we want to know what our buckets are like, because all the buckets are going to be different shapes, different sizes. You know, some have got holes in them, some of them are a bit misshapen. And just in the same way that we all are to a certain degree, and we all learn in slightly different ways. So what are we going to do? So what are we looking at? Well, here at Chem, lovingly called Cambridge Chem, we do baseline assessments. Now, you might very well be familiar with Chem, but for those of you who don't, it's this piece at the beginning of the journey, often referred to as that missing piece, because by knowing where your children are starting from, where your students are starting from, regardless of their previous curriculum, school, background, wherever they came from, you can start to put all of these students on a level playing field. And then you can start to understand their inherent strengths and weaknesses, interestingly, in the context of your own setting, because it does vary from setting to setting. Then, together with all of the other diagnostic tools that you've got and all of the data that you've got, when that child starts your school, your teacher can then plan ambitious yet realistic targets and interventions for them to get that student to the end point, because you understand the nature of the bucket. You understand whether or not you need to put a finger in the side of it to stop it leaking out of it. And this is where we design our assessments to sit alongside other formative assessments and other summative assessments. They're not there to replace anything. They're not there to overlap anything. They're there to support everything. This is a really interesting thing. It was actually Anne, that head of year 7, that gave me a piece of advice once, and it always made me smile. She said, never smile before Christmas. And she said that first term that you've got your students is a journey of discovery. It's a journey of discovery for you, but it's also a journey of discovery for the students. Students need to get to know you. They need to get to know your boundaries. They need to get to know how you work. And then you need to get to know the students. You need to get to know their strengths and weaknesses, and you need to get to know how they like to learn and how they respond in the classroom. Now, wouldn't it be great if you could shortcut some of that? Wouldn't it be great if you could actually have some of that earlier on in the process? That'd be absolutely fantastic. Once again, didn't know about it at the time. We're talking about baselines, so here we are. So what is a baseline? I thought, well, let's keep it really simple. So if you go to any dictionary and look up baseline, you'll find it as a clearly defined starting point. You know, there'll be some fluff around it, but ultimately it's a starting point, and it's the good ones that you've got in there. And again, this is something I learned over time, but the good ones are objective, and they're robust, they're easy, and they're quick to repeat. And in your context, from school's context, this means measuring a set of those fundamental building blocks of learning. Not so much what a child knows at that point. You're all going to do a lot of that over the course of the year anyway, but we're talking about the building blocks of learning, those skills, abilities that we know are really important to academic success. Now, these kinds of baselines, as it says, because and it's the clues in the definition, isn't it? It's starting point. It's most often delivered at the start of an academic year or a start of a learning journey. But that's overly simplifying it a little bit, because really what we're then talking about is, well, it's after any break in learning, or any break that you might have had, any lack of confidence in other data that you might have, or any inconsistency in it if it's all coming from different places. They might all say they've got the same data, but if they're all coming from different sources, do you trust it? How consistent is it? And what do you put in place, if you like, to give yourself that kind of consistency? And it's at that point you start to look at any kind of assessment cycle. Now, I know we're talking about it in the nature of a school here, but you can go to any business at all. You look at a situation, you decide whether or not, do I have enough information to make an informed decision? Okay, I don't. Well, I need to go and find some information. What do? I assess. Okay, I'm going to go and assess. I'm going to test. I'm going to do some formative assessment with my students or whatever I've got in place in front of me, and I'm going to gather data. So I'm going to gather all the data together. That first point. And then what I'm going to analyze all of that data when I've got it. I'm going to start putting it into order. Everybody's talked about a gap analysis. Gap analysis always makes me laugh, because it's really posh way of saying just is one bar bigger than another, or is there a gap where you weren't expecting it? But you analyze the data that you've got, and you gather insights from that data. And once you've got your analysis done, you can then start to plan with that data, because then you can start to plan with the resources that you know you've got available and the context in which school's operating. And once you've done that and you've done your plans, obviously you get on, you teach. I mean, those of you who were going through this, you might recognize it. It's a bit of one of those experiential learning cycles that you've got here, because after you've done all of that, you can say, okay, well, I'm going to reflect. So what have I done? What have I done well? What have I done not so well? What can I do more of? What can I do less of? How can I refine, evolve, and develop what I've got? What best practice can I share with my colleagues? What best practice can I take from other colleagues to improve my own practice? And ultimately monitor that performance over time. And again, we can start to see where we're going. This is great for teachers, but also fantastic for senior leaders within the school, because ultimately the next time, whatever you do, what you want to do, you want to do it better, especially if you're going to do it every year. Which is why we end up here with Chem and our baseline assessments. And we've got a suite of assessments right away from 3 years old, tiny youngsters, right the way through post-16 study. And each of them has been developed to be age appropriate, right the way from a teacher-led, story-based assessment in the early years, right the way through to those pupil-led ones further on, and ultimately we start to predict when you get to secondary onwards. Now, why 6? Well, we've got 6 because we know, as I'm sure you do, that with students at different ages and stages as you go through this learning journey, you want to test different things, and you want to get different insights, so you can better support that journey, so you can make sure the student moves through it much more effectively in a much more engaged way. Now, so leads us on to Chem assessments. So our benefits, what do we do? Well, we've already talked about baseline. We do those adaptive baselines, as you can see here. We're objective, we're independent, which means you've got that robust and consistent benchmark that you can start to apply right away from the beginning. We're 100% digital, yeah, and everybody says that these days, very eco-warrior of us, and that's what we do. And what that does mean from your point of view is it means that actually, because it's digital, you can do away with any teacher marking. It's really fast and flexible to deliver. And we do cater for all ability levels, right the way from 3 through to 16 plus. So you can see we've got huge range of assessments here. And the bit that probably stands us out and makes us a little bit different from other tests out there would be the fact that we're adaptive. I mentioned this before, adaptive versus traditional tests, but what do I mean by that? Well, we've got, if you can imagine your traditional test, and that's the little blobs at the bottom, you've got you need to ask a lot of questions. You need to cater for all the ability ranges that you've got in front of you. And that generally means you're going to ask some easy questions and you're going to ask some hard questions. Most of the questions you're going to ask are going to be somewhere in the middle, and you've got a range in between. Now, because you're trying to capture all of the ability levels and assess all of the ability levels, it means you've got to ask a lot of questions. Okay? If you want an accurate measure, you need to ask a lot of questions to do that. And that invariably means that you've got quite a long assessment. Okay, and it comes with its benefits. We'll not deny that. It comes with its benefits because obviously, if you're asking all of the same questions to all of the students, then you can start identifying trends and themes in terms of their item level responses. It also means that if you're ever challenged on it, you know that all of the students saw the same questions, very much like an exam in that respect. But in terms of an adaptive assessments start at a point where, let's call it the average, for want of a better term. I know it's a horrible word, but let's call it average. So we will start at the average point. And then all of the questions that a student sees are then related to the responses that they give. Okay? So if a student's getting the questions correct, then it means they're going to get more difficult questions. And if the student's getting the questions wrong, well, the questions are going to get easier. Now, this obviously means that we can start chopping out questions. We can ask fewer questions because we're not asking redundant questions. We're not asking overly difficult questions to less able students, and we're not asking overly simple questions all the time to very able students. And this means that you're going to actually get to narrow down into the student's level of ability very, very quickly. Because you're actually starting to target questions exactly where their level of ability is. Obviously, what does this all mean? Well, this is quite interesting because it means then, because you're asking fewer questions, it means you can assess quicker. And it's proven as well that adaptive testing can get you much more accurate results. So you can actually ask more relevant, more questions targeted at a particular level of ability. That's a very personal experience for the learner. Now, the personal experience for the learner is great because it also means you can have them sat next to each other in the classroom because they're all going to see different questions. It also means that you can schedule them and phase them over time because the ability of a student to take actionable insight to the content of the test is heavily mitigated because they're all seeing different questions. Now, from a student's point of view, it's over quicker. It's much more engaging because it's targeting their level of ability, which means they get a better assessment experience, so they're more engaged. I know quite a few schools as well that talk about this and actually talk about the ability to actually mitigate attention deficit to a degree. Obviously, not the more extreme cases, but actually it's worked to highlight in a lot of cases some mild instances where this may be a barrier to learning in the future. Again, one of those questions that you can start prompting a little bit further down your journey. But ultimately, for a new class, you can get a really clear picture of their ability profile in that first few days of term. So you can test, fit it into a single lesson, you can get on with it, and you'll have your results the next day, not 3 months later, as Anne would say, never smile before Christmas, remember. So, in terms of our secondary assessments, very quickly, I'm not able to point here, I'm sure lots of you are familiar with it, but we've got Midges and Yellis. We've got those core units of vocabulary in particular and maths, that numeracy, both of which we know are really important predictors for future performance, and also in particular the non-verbal ability as well. Now it's the non-verbal that's really quite interesting and helps you triangulate a lot of those results, especially for second language learners, against the maths and the vocab, because that then gives you, and ultimately it's something that doesn't require language, it doesn't require curriculum knowledge in order to access. It actually helps you understand what that natural mental agility might be for that particular student. So Midges and Yellis, if we need to know more, we can go through that another time with us. So what kind of data that you get from all of these assessments, because this is why we're here, we want to understand what data we're going to get. Well, the baseline data that we talked about, that clearly defines starting point. Where are your students right now? Yeah, it's a picture of what is, okay, it's your current situation. Yeah. After that, you start looking at, over time, longitudinal data. So you're monitoring this baseline data along with lots of other things over time. Now, this is quite interesting when you start looking at cohorts over time, classes over time, subjects over time. You start to compare it to the performance of previous years, and then you can start to actually target and start pivoting resources a little bit more effectively over that time. Now, obviously, the golden egg in all of this is that predictive data. So what can we do? What are students going to come out with, or what do we think we might come out with at the end of their studies, whether that's GCSE or A-level? This is going to help you set targets and plan those next steps with those students. Not just a flat number for a student, but actually help you have an informed and rich discussion with the student, which can be really, really interesting, especially when their parents get involved as well. And we have what we call value-added reports. Now, if you're not familiar with value-added, I'll keep it really simple. It's the difference between what we told you was going to happen, which was predicted data, and what actually happened. Okay, so this is the reports that you will get after your students have finished their period of study, right back around to the other end, and you can see where the differences occurred. And this obviously helps you spot trends over time, both at a whole school level and at subject-specific level as well. So now that we've got that out of the way, what about you as a teacher? Now, yes, you're going to use the data to do lots of things, because really, as I said before, that first term, that voyage of discovery, so you can understand that the class and the individual students that you've got within it, and this is especially at a time when useful at a time when learning's being disrupted. So don't have to tell anybody here, the last few years we've seen plenty of disruption. So we want to understand the strengths and the weaknesses that we've got, and in each of the students, not just at the student level, but at a class level, not just at a class level, but a cohort level. Because once we understand that, we can then start to plan ahead. We can start to use that data to set realistic but aspirational targets for each of the students, and also encourage and support them to do their best right the way through their studies. Now, also gives you some pretty hard evidence about your student development to back up your end of year assessment as well, whether that's peer review or self-assessment right the way through it. It's going to give you really interesting conversations with parents, because it's not just based on observational data. Again, you've got this robust and independent benchmark that's supporting what you're doing and then informing what you're doing as a teacher to support and get the best out of that particular student. So we're going to have a look at a few of the reports. I'll blast through them a little bit. I'm not going to labor them. I'm sure you've seen them all before. But we'll start with an individual student record. Now, this is looking at a single student and their relative strengths and weaknesses. So you'll get your vocab, your maths, non-verbal skills and so forth. With that red line being that standardized score that we all know and love. Anything above the line, good. Anything below the line, well, we need to investigate that and work on it. So what can we do, and how can I use this in the classroom? Well, imagine almost on the second day of term, imagine having one of these for every single one of the students in your classroom. I would have loved it. I would have loved it as a student. Sorry, as a teacher. As a student, you probably love it as well. But as a teacher, I think you'll love it, because you've got that data right at the start of the year. And I've talked to lots of teachers, and there's not a single one of them that said, you know what, I've got too much time with my students. I think I can give some back. I think that everybody would like some more time with their students. And more to the point, everybody would like to understand more about their students earlier, because the earlier you can understand what's going on, the sooner you can start to put interventions in place. And the sooner you can start putting interventions in place, the more time you've actually got to correct anything that might need support or development. So you've got one of these for each student, which is great. And you've also got predictions for each student and all of their subjects, which is also great. And I hear you shudder, and I hear you shudder because nobody likes to look at a table full of letters and grades. Well, some people do, but most people don't like to look at a table full of great predictions and grades. What we're really interested in is actually how likely is all of that? Because we're saying, well, we're not putting people in the pigeonhole. You scored this, so you're going to come out with a grade of 6, for example, in case of this one here. So are you going to come out with a grade of 6? Well, you might be the most likely outcome. And I'm going to use the word average again. I know that nobody likes the word average, but when we talk about the prediction and the grade that's going to come out, we're talking about an average. We're talking about a statistical spread of all of the similar students that, were with the similar scores that have been and gone in the past. What did they actually go on to achieve? Okay. There's an average in there. It's a statistical spread. But understanding where you are or where your student is in relation to that average is really incredibly important. It's incredibly important from your point of view because it gives you a good degree of confidence in what target you might want to set for the student. But also it means that you can have a really informed discussion with the student, with the parent, about exactly what those targets should look like and develop that dialogue with the student about, okay, well, we're saying it's predicted a 6. The 6 is based on the average. Are you going to put the average amount of effort in? Are you going to get the average amount of support at home? Are you going to put the average amount of effort into your homework? Well, if the answer is, well, no, I'm going to do more than the average, then chances are you start to look a little bit further up the grade scale. If it's not, and I know nobody will say, oh, I'm not going to bother, I'm not going to do anything to your face, but there's the conversation to be had, because this is something that you don't just do once at the start of the term, but you use it to inform discussion and dialogue right the way through the course of the journey. You can bring it out at any point and say, okay, well, this is what we talked about and this is how we decided on your target grades. Is this still the case? Is it? Isn't it? What can we do about it? Do we need to make any changes? Because ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to maintain that trajectory as a student passes through your school. Now, I'm going to show you a little example here, and once again, you might need to squint. Broad example of how you might want to use this data, or how you can start to use the data as well. So we'll have the subjects down. This will be for a single student. You'll have your subjects down the left-hand side, for example. You might have a chem target grade you can see here. But in there, you can also start to see what target, after discussion, you decide to give to that particular student. And then obviously, and this is where the interesting bit starts coming in, because we're starting to attach it to all of the other data that you've got within the school. Like I said, schools are data generating machines, like lots of places. We want to use it all together, because if you look at one bit in isolation, you only see part of the picture. You put it all together, you see the whole picture. So now we can see the target that we've set. We can see the level at which they're operating at. So academically, what is their achievement as they proceed through the year? And you can maintain those scores. And then you can start to look at, well, what effort? So pastorally, what effort is the student putting in? And then you can start to, interestingly, the far right-hand side, you can start to look at objectively their progress towards target and what barriers might be getting in the way for them. Now, this could be any number of different things, but if you look at this particular student in the example here, you can see that they're really they seem to be really struggling with English and history, but they're actually not doing too bad when it comes to the sciences as well. So there's obviously a disconnect somewhere in there. There's something not quite right. So, as I said before, any good assessment doesn't necessarily answer all of your questions, but it will certainly help you ask the right ones. The next right ones are obviously, well, what's going on with English and history? Let's go talk to the classroom teacher. What's happening with the classroom teacher? What's happening with the student? It might be a sit down at that point. It might be a discussion with the parents. It might be coming up to parents' evening, and it's something that you want to bring up there. Either way, it's giving you the objective data with which you can start to have an informed conversation with the stakeholders that you've got. Right. Speaking of stakeholders, your needs as a senior leader. Often we'll have to consider our stakeholders as part of that conversation much more effectively. Much more effectively, but in much more detail. We want to be able to look at what we're doing, because we need to be able to say what we are doing as a senior leader is an effective use of the resources and the staff that we've got. So we want to benchmark the success of the school. That's a no-brainer. We want to be able to use all of this data to start to drive either department-wide, school-wide, cohort-wide, or even specific intervention strategies that are going to help you improve the performance of the school and students. Now, by doing that, it's going to help you measure the success of those strategies as well, because you can then start to look at all of this data over time, and then you can understand whether or not you're actually moving the needle in the right direction. Obviously, importantly as well, you want to be able to prove to those other stakeholders that that you're being effective in terms of what you're doing, and the fact that you're actually getting ahead of other schools that are possibly similar to where you are at that time. So, once again, look at a couple of the reports, and I'll move on quickly. We can start to aggregate the data at this point. So we're probably not looking at individual students, but we start looking at classes, we start looking at year groups, we start looking at whole schools. Okay, the bars that you can see on the left-hand side, if you're familiar with the reports, you can see that they're quartiles. A band being your upper quartile, B band being your lower quartile, B and C both in the middle. You can look at these over time. It's an interesting one as well, because when you start looking at these particular bars over time, you can start to see the relative strengths and weaknesses of cohorts that you've had over time. Now, you might, for example, if you look at the latest bar here, you can see actually top quarter and the upper part of average is probably not too far away from the year before, but I can see straight away that you've got more D-band students coming in. Now, and if that happens to be the vocabulary score, well, you might want to start addressing, well, or asking the question, well, do we have a lot of second language students coming in this year? Is there a reason why? Is it COVID related? What might we do to support that? It might be that you put more vocabulary-based interventions in place. You might increase the number of Lexia sessions. You might increase the amount of reading homework. You might embed more English functional skills, if you like, into classroom teaching in niche subjects as a whole. You might do any number of other things. Okay, the point is you can see this, and you can see this very early, which means, once again, the earlier you see it, the sooner you can do something about it. The sooner you can do something about it, the more chance you have of actually moving that needle in the right direction. So what does it all mean? Okay, and again, I know this is going to be really simplistic for you, but if you look at that first one there, let's have a little look at why we're here, what we're trying to do with it, and what the reports can do when we start to put them into practice. Okay, we can see there in term one, we look at the data. It's a picture of what is. If we remember that one, we've done our assessment, we've done our analysis, we've started to put things into action. Okay. Term two, we start to have the conversations with the parents and the stakeholders we're going through. How are you getting on in relation to the targets that we've set and the support interventions that we've put in place? Okay. You've reached the end of the year and you start around on term one again. Let's do our lessons learned, because ultimately what we want to do is adapt, evolve, refine what we do as practitioners. So we're not standing still, we're moving forward, we're improving, we're developing. Because having this information at your fingertips, as well as the kind of, I suppose, the knowledge of the children that you've got at that personal level, can start to help you formulate really smart targets and goals. And those smart targets and goals can obviously be measured, and measured quite effectively. And that ultimately is where you're going to lead to those informed conversations that we've been talking about. So I'm going to take a breath now. And at this point, I'd like to hand back over to Gemma Valpy. Gemma's going to talk to you through some very exciting developments and that we've got coming up soon.
Thank you, John. And yes, it is very exciting. So we've got a new assessment that's coming from Chem. It's launching shortly, so within the next month, and it's the Cambridge Wellbeing Check. So this is based on research from the University of Cambridge, and the wellbeing check will give you, alongside the cognitive ability tests that John's been discussing today, a sort of holistic view of that student. So it's measuring 4 areas of wellbeing: life satisfaction, interpersonal wellbeing, competence wellbeing, and negative emotion. And it will give you a very quick view of where your students are. So where are they doing well? Where are they not doing so well? Where do they need more support to help them through the year? It's computer-based, as John said, we're 100% digital, so computer-based assessment. It takes 20 minutes. It's a student-led questionnaire, so any students between the ages of 7 and 18 can self-complete. And it gives you reporting at student level, class level, and school level, as well as over a period of time as well. So you can see individual students and where they are and any support needs they might have, but also you can assess the well-being of your whole cohort within a year or the whole school. And as I said, you can track that over time. So we have the ability to run the test multiple times during the academic year, and that means you can see any changes to the well-being of your students across that year, which can be particularly helpful if you're planning interventions for well-being. At some point, you can test prior to the intervention and post-intervention and see whether that's had an impact on the well-being of your students. We are going to include a link to this, to the web pages for this on the emails that come out to you afterwards. So if you would like some more information, you can have a look at the website, or you can get in touch with us and we'll be able to tell you more about it when it launches soon. So thank you. I'm going to have a quick look at the box and see if we've got any questions coming through. I've got some organisers in the background here, and I just want to see if they can see any questions, because my view is not showing any questions for either John or I at this point. So if we can just have a heads up from somebody whether there is anything that needs answering. And if anybody has not yet put any questions in, please do. John and I can give you some answers now. No, I still can't see anything coming through.
So I've got some questions, Gemma. Sorry, let me just pop the box
brilliant,
out.
Adam. Thank you. I was worrying actually, because I was thinking, I think it's my view of it that means I can't see them. So if you wouldn't mind reading them out, and either myself or John, or probably more likely John, will be able to answer them.
Yeah, let me just scroll back to the top. Okay, so expand this. So this is quite a long question, so I'm having to expand the box that I'm looking at.
I'm just glad you have the box, Adam, because whoever it was that set me up decided that I shouldn't be trusted with the questions box.
Always the way. So Jason asks a couple of questions. How do your baseline tests hold up to exam preparation? I.e., how does student performance change with repeated exposure to the question style or the assessment? There's another part to that, but maybe you'd best answering that one first.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Adam. Great question, Jason. Let me see, how does it hold up to exam preparation? As I said before, it's often assessments like this are done as a baseline. So there's that start of that learning journey. Interestingly, when we start looking at the mid-use assessment, so the mid-use assessment includes a proofreading section. Now, the proofreading section is really tightly timed. So the students have actually got to read through a passage of text, identify spelling, grammatical errors, understand what they're actually reading, and they've got to do that in a really tight time frame. Lots of schools use that to test what they might call exam readiness, or the ability of the student to work under pressure or timed pressure. And when you start looking at that in particular in relation to the vocabulary score, then a lot of schools will start looking at the differences between those two schools. And then that tends to highlight, or can highlight for a lot of schools, the relative exam readiness of particular students and how well they're likely to cope with that kind of pressure in time. Now, in answer to the other part of that question that I think I saw in there as well, which is how does repeated exposure affect it? Well, this is always going to be the really interesting piece, because if you continue to practice any kind of assessment, then you're going to become better at it. If you're going to read more, then, well, there you go. Your vocabulary is going to increase. If you practice lots of maths questions, then generally speaking, you're going to become more numerate. So yes, you can, with repeated exposure, become better at these kinds of tests, but ultimately it's these building blocks that you might be looking to evolve and develop anyway in your students, which is only a good thing as far as I can see. So I think that there's a couple of parts to that. Yes, ultimately over time you can get better at it. The adaptive nature of the assessments, though, means that you're not going to see the same questions time after time. So chances of you actually being able to say, okay, I'm going to practice exactly this question, because you're probably not going to see it again. So it's less of an issue in that respect. I'm going to glance this way so I can have a little look at your other question. So how does reading age impact on non-verbal outcomes? That's an awesome question as well. And reading between the lines in that one, you might have a number of second language learners in particular. So for example, if you've got a second language learner, their vocabulary, their reading score might be a bit lower than you might see from a native speaker, and that's completely understandable. But how does that relate to what they're going to do when they move on? Because obviously you'd expect students like that to develop at a faster rate. The interesting bit, especially when you start matching that against the non-verbal questions, that's really quite interesting, because those non-verbals are a way of that testing that, let's call it just mental agility, neuroplasticity. I'm sure there's terms for it. But if you start to test that, then it helps you make sense of and put the vocabulary score into context and start asking questions on it. So where might the vocabulary score end up, all things being equal? Because the non-verbal elements don't require curriculum knowledge. They don't require, well, they require a degree of language to understand the question itself, but the nature of the questions are actually sort of fairly language agnostic, for want of a better term. So it actually helps you use the tests to triangulate what you might see with somebody who's perhaps who you know is a second language learner. If they're not a second language learner, then that actually prompts another question as well, why is there a difference there? And that's something else that you would want to investigate. There might be something that might have come through a note from their previous school, their feeder school, or it might be something that you simply need to have a conversation with the parents about as well. But ultimately, it's about identifying a gap or an inconsistency in what you're seeing and what you expected to happen, and then asking the next question to try and find out, well, why is that the case? What's driving that? Because once you understand what's driving it, then actually if I find that root cause, I can start to do something with it. I'm just glancing again because I can see a third part. How confident are we that adaptive testing doesn't prevent candidates from attempting material they are competent in? Okay. I think if I understand it rightly, it's how confident are we that the material that we've got within the tests actually covers all the ability ranges, and the relative levels of difficulty are actually the right relative levels of difficulty, I think, if I'm understanding the question right. And the answer to that is because we've tested it tens of thousands of times and across lots and lots of students, and we've taken each of these items and we've tested them thousands and thousands of times to try and find out which ones are the difficult ones and which ones are the easier ones. And by putting all of these together, that point at which students start to get them right or start to get them wrong, I'm not going to get into the statistics of it because I'm no statistician. Suffice to say that there's some very complex statistics behind it that start to put those assessment items into order, and the assessment itself, the clever algorithm behind it, will select those questions based on those item responses that the student will be having. I can see more questions coming through.
Should we ask you some of these, or are you okay?
No, it's fine. I'll work through them. There's the potential issue of fairness and validity if candidates are answering different questions at different points of the assessment. Yeah, well, if you're using the assessment as a high stakes assessment, so if it was an exam situation where there was some pretty high stakes at the end of it, then this is what I meant about before. If all of the students see the same questions, then you can argue that it's more defensible in terms of you've all seen the same questions, so therefore it's a level playing field. Assessment conditions, you're all in the same hall on the same day at the same time, you've all seen the same questions. If the assessment has a different purpose, and the assessment is a low stakes assessment that is designed to give you that baseline right at the start of the term, then there's less of a need to be defensible about it, because it's not a high stakes assessment. It's an assessment that's designed to give you the most effective, useful insight into the individual students as quickly as possible. And that's exactly what this does. So yes, absolutely, adaptive testing in a high stakes environment is less defensible than a static test. I couldn't agree more, but we need to understand our objectives of the assessment and why we're doing it in the first place. And that's the space where we sit with our baselines that we're talking about. And I think, let me see, I think what evidence that validity isn't impacted. Again, I think it's the evidence that the validity isn't impacted is simply the fact that the students see enough questions, and if the students see enough questions, then you get a measure of a particular ability level or level of ability in a particular area, whether it be verbal, whether it be numeracy, whether it be non-verbal. As I said before, it's the nature of a low stakes assessment to be diagnostic like this isn't designed to be defensible, and it's not necessarily the objective that you're going to have when you put the test in place. If that test is in place for a high stakes purpose, so I take the 11 pluses as an example, then yeah, okay, you want all of your students to see the same questions because you're using it in a high stakes scenario, in a high stakes environment. The diagnostic baselines that we're talking about, low stakes assessment, designed for quick, easy and robust use at the start of a year to inform and develop interventions for students. So getting that correct measure, getting that accurate measure is actually in the best interest of the student, the school, parents and everybody, because the more accurate measure you can get at the start of the year means that you've got the more reliable information to work with at the start of that particular term as quickly as possible. So that would bring me on to that one. So I'm going to take a breath and a sip, Adam, if you want to find me the next question.
Of course. So the next question is, the individual subject target setting for students with spiky profiles can often produce skewed data, particularly for mathematics. Why? Or maybe that was referring to a particular graph. I don't know if Gillian, if you're still here, if you could maybe elaborate on that question maybe a bit more. We can move on to the next.
I'm not sure if I saw the spiky. What I would say to that is, yes, it may result in a spikier profile, or you may find that some graphs will have a spikier profile. The spikier profile generally means that in the past, students of a particular ability profile have achieved a more consistent result, particular result or particular grade. If you remember what I said before, the predictions themselves are actually based on actual results mapped against the test results of students that have been and gone before. So they're not mathematical models, they're actually actual results that students have gone. They've been fed into a model so that we can use them. But ultimately that profile, that shape and profile gives you an idea of exactly what sort of likelihood of the outcomes that you're going to get for any particular subject or any particular student based on their ability level. You're absolutely right. Sometimes they are spiky, and sometimes they might be a little flatter. But either way, this then gives you information that you can use moving forward. If you've got a spikier profile, you can be generally a bit more confident in terms of where the result might end up. So in terms of target setting, that might make it a little bit easier. In terms of a flatter profile, well, actually a flatter profile might indicate that there are more variables in play in terms of what you might need to do in order to achieve some of the high results. So once again, this then points you into another direction about how best to support the students in that particular subject. hope that answers that question, if I understood it.
Great, thank you. So the next one's from Anita, and she asks, how does the well-being test correlate with the cognitive test?
I'll let Gemma answer that one.
So actually they sit completely separately. So although they will be testing students of similar age, and you can use both of those things alongside each other, I think John showed a chart earlier where you could talk about effort and include that as an extra piece of data when you're looking at students overall and where they might land up. So certainly you can use the well-being data, but it's not built into the cognitive assessment tests. It's not run in parallel with them. So it is a completely separate test. You could take it on without using cognitive tests from Chem or vice versa.
Yeah,
Great,
I'll just add one quick point to that as well. I think there's been a few kind of news pieces come out in not too recent past that have talked about the relative links between exam performance and well-being, whether or not you look at those in isolation or not. The power, I think, of all of the data that you've got is when you start putting it together. So as I said before, if you don't look at the chem data in isolation, actually, when you put it together with all of the other bits, all the pastoral, all of the academic data that you've got, and you start to build that incredibly rich picture of a student, not just a picture of the student, but actually their progress over time as they with their journey with you. That in itself is quite a powerful tool. So I would say on its own, possibly not necessarily. Will it correlate directly? I would say, probably, as Gemma said, not. Is it still important, and should it be part of that overall picture that you take into account when you're planning and making decisions for students? Oh, absolutely, I couldn't agree more. The more that you can include, the better.
Great, thanks guys. So next question is from Simon, and he asks, with chem assessments, can I tell if a department is teaching better to the top, middle, or bottom?
You can tell, well, it depends on your department, I suppose, but absolutely you can look at the results at subject level. This is absolutely what you're designed to do. I think the reports that we're talking about in particular are probably those value-added reports. So if you remember, the value-added reports is that difference between what we predicted would happen based on all of the students that have gone on in the past, and then what actually happened, which means that yes, we're using not a generic, but a universal kind of statistical spread of the results that came in. We're then starting to, in value-added, put them into a very, very specific and a very unique context of your particular school. Now, those reports themselves, you can look at from a whole school level, you can look at from a subject level as well. You can look at them over a specific year. You can look at individual students. You can see exactly which students are driving the performance, whether it's up or down. And then, of course, you can start to use the data as well to look at it longitudinally over time. That then is going to do exactly what you said you wanted to do, which is, can I see whether or not a particular subject or department is performing upper, middle, or below? Then absolutely, yes, that will, I wouldn't say perform, because perform might be the wrong word in that particular context, but it will certainly give you an indication that the particular subject results aren't performing consistently as some of the others might, which will then inform more questions, obviously, in terms of investigations and why that might be the case. It might have been, you might have had, I don't know, you might have a particular, a very steady staff base in terms of, I don't know, let's pick the maths department. Everybody picks on the maths department. So you might have a very steady maths department for a number of years, and then for whatever reason they all win the lottery, so they all leave, and so you've got no maths teachers, and so you've got a period of transition, because we all know good maths teachers are like gold dust. So it's trying to rebuild that particular department might take time. So you might have results up here, the results might drop down here, but over time, as you build them back, you might see the results go back up. I know that's a bit of a fictitious, I'd love to win the lottery as well, but it's a fictitious example. But but you get the idea. You can see what might be driving it and understand it. You can then ask the questions. And then ultimately, once you've asked the questions, you understand what the nature of the problem might be, then you can start to do something about it. So remember that experiential learning cycle right at the beginning. So we identify what the issue is, we assess, we find the data, we analyze what we've got, and then we plan, we do something about it, and then we reflect on it. That cycle continues. And yeah, absolutely, you can see which subjects are going to be performing better than others.
Right.
Anyway.
Thanks, John. Yes, we've got another one from Simon. He also asks, which other schools am I compared to?
Which other schools are you compared to? Simple answer is all of the ones that do our assessments. So I don't have absolute numbers off the top of my head. So you're being compared to anything and everything that we've got data for. So if you're comparing yourself, so we're comparing ourselves to the UK standard. So exactly what it would say. So all of the data that we've got that comes in to inform that UK standard is what you're getting compared against. Now, in terms of the standard that we're talking about, in terms of what we're comparing against, we use a 5-year rolling average. One of the reasons we use a 5-year rolling average is to make sure that we can iron out any potential kinks, inconsistencies and anomalies that might exist from year to year. Because ultimately, one of the biggest benefits of what we're doing is making sure that what we give you is going to be that consistent measure, and that consistent measure is going to be something that you're going to be able to confidently use from one year to the next. That's really important. So what you've got is a consistent standard that you're going to be able to use that is comparing you to the other schools that will take our assessments, and we will take all of that data over a number of years to smooth it out and create that standard. So that would be what you're being compared against. In answer to it, there'll be over 500,000 students worth of data points informing that particular standard. So, as I said before, average is a horrible word that nobody likes to use and nobody likes to think of themselves as average, but statistically, average is just that bit in the middle. Understanding where you are in relation to it and why is the power, and that gives you the opportunity to shift the needle.
Thank you. We've got a couple more, I think. So how does guessing an answer impact the accuracy of the results?
Everybody guesses to a certain degree, but in terms of the assessments that we've got, and again, this is how it differs slightly from traditional or static tests to adaptive tests, where each of the students might actually see a different number of questions based on the speed at which they progress through the assessment. But in terms of in terms of how guessing affects it, not really, because if you guess, you get it right, well, the system doesn't panic. It continues on that particular length, and this is about a pattern and trend over time and how difficult the questions get. Eventually, it's that level that you start to vary around. There's always going to be a degree of guesswork. Even in a static test, there's a degree of guesswork. If you don't know the answer, the students will have a stab at it. But in terms of the adaptive nature of the assessment, it means that if they do have a guess and they get it right or they get it wrong, they'll move on to the next question quite quickly. So any guesswork is then smoothed out to a degree. What you'll see, actually, interestingly, in those reports, the student profiles, you'll see what we call a box and whisker. So you'll see the dot, and that's where the system's defined the score. That's the score that the student's been given. And the whiskers are kind of like let's call it a confidence limit. And that confidence limit is what a student might do on any given day, for want of a better term. And that confidence limit actually tells you roughly how much guesswork's gone into it. So what you might have, for example, if you've got really long whiskers, then you can see that the answering that the students had has been quite inconsistent. So they've got some tough questions right, and they've got some easy questions wrong, and it's been a bit all over the place. If you've got quite narrow whiskers, it means that actually the answering has been quite consistent. And so the system itself is more confident, hence smaller confidence limits. So you can see where it's going to end up, but it's actually really quite nice to have those confidence limits in there.
Okay, and the last one isn't actually a question, it's a clarification from Gillian about, she was the one who had the question about the spiky data.
Ah, right.
So she says, after the baseline mid-YIS, pupils have a pupil profile, e.g. high vocabulary but low mathematics score. However, the students receive a very high mathematics target, higher than science and English.
Right, okay, I'm with you now. Okay, the predictions are formed out of a combination of both the vocabulary and maths. And that's what they found, or that's what the statisticians found to correlate most highly. So that is what then ends up going out. So you may at times find that, because we're using the combination of the profile results to form the predictions, you may find that some of those predictions, particularly in the case that you're talking about there, where the student might score really high with vocab but low in maths but still be predicted high for maths, actually it means that the student that's got the high vocab score is going to be better able to access the curriculum within there and then potentially going to score higher anyway over time. But also it means that that particular breakdown is going to allow you to take, as I said before, don't just take the result and chisel it in stone. Let's take the result, put it together with the other parts of the data and start to question it as well. Does that sound right? Does that sound right based on previous academic performance? Does that sound right based on the other results and the other section scores that we've seen coming through? Regardless of what we use it for, we will still see that correlation between the score that the student got from the test and their chances and likelihood of what they're going to achieve moving on in the future. Again, same example included. And yes, you're absolutely right. It might be spikier and it might be more difficult to understand. So in that particular instance, what you might do is say, okay, in that case, I'm going to bring that particular prediction down. Or you might say, I'm going to include and use that prediction where it is, but then review it over a period of time, as we can see how the student is actually developing over the course of that particular year. Happy to have another conversation about that. Probably offline might be better.
That's it for all the questions now.
Thank you very much, Adam, for bailing me out there with my lack of questions box, and thank you, John, for all your answers. We're a couple of minutes over, so it just leaves me to thank everybody for joining us today, and a reminder that you'll get a couple of emails from us, one with certificate of attendance and the second one with the recording and the slides, as well as that web link for the wellbeing check. So thank you very much, everybody. That's the end of today's showcase webinar from Chem.